It was just another ordinary Tuesday evening in our household, the kind where you're winding down from the day's work, thinking about what to cook for dinner, and maybe catch up on some TV shows you've missed. Mike, my husband of 20 years, was lounging on the sofa, flicking through channels, while I was in the kitchen pondering whether spaghetti or chicken salad would be the lesser of two evils for our waistlines. I was thinking about what our 19-year-old son Alex eats in college. That's when the phone rang, cutting through the mundane silence of our home. Mike glanced at the caller ID and sighed. "It's my folks." There was a hint of reluctance in his voice that didn't go unnoticed. "Go on, pick it up." "It's been ages since we last heard from them," I called out from the kitchen, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. Mike's parents, Linda and George, weren't exactly the easiest people to get along with. Their rare calls usually meant they wanted something. Mike pressed the speaker button, and we both braced ourselves. "Hey, Mom, Dad, what's up?" The voice that came through was Linda's, choked with tears. "Oh, Mike, it's all gone. Everything's gone." George's gruffer, more panicked tone interjected. "The company, son. It tanked. We've lost the house, the cars, everything." I stopped what I was doing, the gravity of their situation sinking in. Mike and I exchanged worried glances. Despite our strained relationship, hearing them so vulnerable struck a chord. "So, what's the plan now? Where are you guys staying?" Mike asked, his voice tight with concern. "That's just it, son. We have nowhere to go. We were hoping, maybe, we could come stay with you and Kareen for a while." Linda's voice was hopeful, yet hesitant. Mike ran a hand through his hair, a clear sign he was stressed. "Well, you know the house is actually Kareen's, left to her by her grandma. I gotta talk to her about it." I knew what was coming next. As much as Linda and George could be a handful, they were still his parents. Turning them away wasn't an option, not really. I walked into the living room, taking the phone from Mike. "Linda, George, listen, we can figure something out. But it's only temporary, okay? Just until you get back on your feet." "Oh, thank you, dear. You're a lifesaver. We won't be any trouble, promise," Linda gushed, relief evident in her voice. After we hung up, Mike slumped back on the couch, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Babe, you sure about this? You know how they are. Always looking down on our lifestyle, expecting the moon." I sighed, sitting next to him, taking his hand. I know. But they're your folks. What else can we do? We'll set some ground rules. Make it clear it's just for a few months." Mike nodded, looking somewhat relieved, but still anxious. "They mentioned bringing some things. I hope it's not their entire house." The morning Linda and George were due to arrive felt like the calm before the storm. Mike and I had been up since dawn, double-checking every room to ensure everything was as comfortable as possible. Our attempt to bring some order before the inevitable chaos. "Kareen, do you think they'll like the setup in their room?" Mike asked for what felt like the 10th time, his forehead creased with worry. I shrugged, adjusting a pillow for the umpteenth time. "They'll have to. It's not the Ritz, but it's the best we can do." The sound of engines rumbling down our street cut our conversation short. We exchanged a look that said, "Here we go," and made our way to the front door. As we stepped outside, two massive moving trucks pulled up, blocking our driveway. "Jesus, did they bring the whole house?" I muttered under my breath as Mike squeezed my hand, a silent plea for patience. Linda and George emerged from a sleek rental car, looking every bit the displaced royalty. Linda, with her fur coat draped over her shoulders, despite the mild weather, and George, in a suit that looked too formal for our quiet, suburban street. "Kareen, Mike. Oh, how we've missed you!" Linda exclaimed, embracing me with a force that nearly knocked the wind out of me. "Good to see you, Mom, Dad," Mike managed, his voice tight as he accepted their hugs. As the movers began unloading, the sheer volume of some things they'd mentioned became horrifyingly clear. Furniture, boxes, more boxes, and endless bags started piling up in our driveway. Mike and I helped direct the movers, but it quickly became apparent that our house was not prepared for the influx. Every room on the ground floor was soon crowded with their belongings, leaving just narrow paths to navigate through. As the movers left, George clapped his hands together, looking pleased. "Well, this feels homier already, doesn't it?" That evening, after a day of moving and rearranging, we sat down for dinner. The air was thick with tension, an uncomfortable blend of gratitude and resentment simmering just below the surface. "So, Corinne, this spaghetti is interesting," Linda remarked, poking at her plate with a fork as if she expected it to bite back. "It's a family recipe," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Simple but good." Was all she said, but her expression spoke volumes. Mike, sensing my growing frustration, jumped in. "Mom, Dad, we're really glad we could help out in your time of need. But we need to remember we're all in this together. It's going to be a bit of an adjustment for everyone." The conversation stumbled along, a clumsy dance around the obvious elephants in the room. After dinner, as we were clearing the table, Mike pulled me aside. "Corinne, this is going to be harder than we thought," he whispered, his eyes filled with concern. I sighed, leaning into him. "We knew it wouldn't be easy. But we'll make it work. Somehow." The initial excitement of Linda and George's arrival quickly faded, replaced by the daily grind and growing tensions. It wasn't long before their true colors started to show, and with it, the first of many demands. One morning, barely a week into their stay, I was in the kitchen whipping up what I considered a decent breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and some fresh fruit on the side. Simple, yet filling. That's when Linda strolled in, a look of disdain plastered across her face as she eyed the plates on the counter. "Corinne, darling, is this what you call breakfast?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. I turned, forcing a smile. "It's what we usually have. Keeps us going until lunch." Linda scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. No, this won't do at all. Back in our house, we had freshly squeezed orange juice, croissants, and sometimes even smoked salmon for breakfast. You must try a bit harder, dear." I felt a knot form in my stomach, frustration bubbling up. "Linda, you know we're not living in luxury here. This is what we eat. If you'd like something else, you're welcome to make it." The rest of the meal passed in awkward silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Mike caught my eye, giving me a sympathetic look that said he'd handle it later. But breakfast was just the beginning. Later that week, George approached me as I was sorting the laundry, a list in hand. "Corinne, we need to talk about the groceries. This list here," he said, waving the paper in front of me, "is what Linda and I usually enjoy. We've been very accommodating, but it's time we returned to some semblance of our normal lifestyle." I took the list, my eyes widening as I scanned the items. Marbled steaks, exotic fruits, imported cheeses. The price of these items would blow our grocery budget out of the water. "George, you do realize we're on a budget, right? We can't afford these things on a regular basis." He frowned, crossing his arms. "Well, you'll just have to make do, won't you? We can't be expected to live like this. It's beneath us." I was at a loss for words. The audacity of their demands, their complete disregard for our situation, it was all too much. That night, I vented to Mike, my patience wearing thin. He promised he would talk to them. But talking seemed to do little good. Linda and George remained firmly planted in their bubble of entitlement, making life increasingly difficult for us. The breaking point came when Linda refused to eat the chicken casserole I had prepared for dinner, calling it peasant food. She demanded we order takeout from a pricey restaurant instead. "Listen, Linda, we're doing our best here," I snapped, my patience finally gone. "This is what we're having. If you don't like it, then I'm sorry, but that's just too bad." Her face went red, and for a moment, I thought she might actually explode. This is no way to treat your guests, Karine. We are your elders, and you should be showing us more respect. Mike stepped in, his tone firm. Mom, Dad, you're not guests. You're living here because you have nowhere else to go. Karine's right. We can't afford to eat out or buy expensive groceries. You need to respect that this is our home and our rules. The conversation ended with Linda storming off to her room, George following closely behind, muttering about ungrateful children. A whole month had gone by since Linda and George turned our lives upside down. It started with them making a scene at breakfast one morning, both of them clutching their stomachs and making a big show of how our average food was wreaking havoc on their digestion. This bread, it's like eating cardboard. And don't get me started on the eggs. My stomach's been in knots. Linda complained, her voice teetering between a whine and a demand. George chimed in with a groan, I haven't felt right since we got here. We need proper food, not this peasant fare. Feeling cornered and wanting to keep the peace, I caved. I started buying the fanciest groceries I could find for them, while Mike and I resorted to fast food just to save on costs. Fast forward a month, and I'm sitting at the kitchen table, receipts scattered in front of me. My heart sank as I tallied up the numbers. We were spending double on groceries, compared to before Linda and George's arrival. And that wasn't even touching on the water bill, which had skyrocketed thanks to Linda's newfound love for long, luxurious baths. Enough was enough. That evening, as I served dinner, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Linda and George were tucking into their gourmet dishes, while Mike and I nibbled on cheap takeout. My frustration boiled over. Listen up, I started, my voice steady but firm. This can't go on. We're blowing through our budget trying to cater to your tastes. From now on, we're all eating the same food. No more special treatment. Linda looked up, her fork paused midair. You can't be serious. This food is the only thing keeping our health from plummeting in this hovel. George nodded in agreement. Exactly. You expect us to eat fast food? That's absurd. You're being incredibly selfish and lazy, Karine. Their words stung, but I was past caring about their opinions. Before I could retort, Mike slammed his fist down on the table, a rare show of anger from him. That's enough, he barked. You're living under our roof, in Karine's house. You will show her respect. She's been bending over backward to accommodate you, and this is how you repay her? No more. Either you start eating what we provide, or you can find somewhere else to live. The room went silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Linda and George exchanged a look, then silently returned to their meal. The day after the big blow-up, things escalated in a way I couldn't have imagined. It started with a knock at the door, mid-morning. I was in the middle of tidying up the living room, Mike having gone out to run some errands. The delivery guy, a young lad probably in his early 20s, stood there with a smirk, holding a stack of fancy-looking food boxes. Delivery for Karine, he announced, thrusting the boxes into my arms, before I could even open my mouth. Confused, I stared down at the assortment of gourmet meals, the kind that cost an arm and a leg from the high-end place downtown. There's been some mistake. I didn't order this. Just then, Linda breezed in, a smug smile on her face. Oh, those are for us. I couldn't stomach another day of that dreadful food you've been serving. I was flabbergasted. And how do you plan on paying for this? I asked, trying to keep my cool. Linda waved a dismissive hand. Oh, don't worry, dear. It's on you. Consider it a thank you for our stay. Fury bubbled up inside me, but before I could confront her further, the phone rang. It was Mike, checking in. I quickly explained the situation, my voice shaking with anger. Stay calm. I'll handle it when I get back, he said, his tone tight with frustration. But staying calm was easier said than done. By the time Mike got back, Linda and George had made themselves comfortable, devouring their expensive meals with relish while I fumed silently. That evening, Mike and I sat them down for another talk. This time, the gloves were off. "Mom, Dad, this has got to stop," Mike began, his voice low but firm. "You can't just order expensive meals on our dime. It's not right." George scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, please. It's the least you can do after forcing us to eat like paupers." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Forcing you? We're going broke trying to keep you happy." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Well, maybe if you managed your money better, you wouldn't be in this situation." That did it. I lost my cool. Managed our money better? We were fine before you showed up, turning our lives upside down. Mike stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's it. We've been more than accommodating, but it's clear you have no respect for us or our home. You need to leave." Their reaction was immediate and explosive. Linda started crying, wailing about how ungrateful we were, while George shouted threats about telling everyone how horribly we'd treated them. The argument raged on, voices raised, accusations flying. It was a mess. In the end, Linda and George stormed off to their room, slamming the door behind them. After the debacle with the gourmet food delivery, things went from bad to unbearable. Linda and George's entitlement had reached new heights, and Mike and I were at our wits' end. The final straw came on a chilly Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen, trying to make do with what was left in the pantry for dinner, when Linda sauntered in, her nose wrinkled in disgust at the aroma of the stew I was cooking. "That smells, what is that?" she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. "It's beef stew." "It's what's for dinner," I replied, keeping my focus on the pot to avoid snapping at her. Linda made a show of gagging. "I can't possibly eat that." "You know, it wouldn't kill you to try a little harder, Corinne. This is no way to treat guests." Dinner was a tense affair, with Linda and George barely touching their food while making passive-aggressive comments about the lack of variety. I was seething, but I bit my tongue, determined not to let them get the best of me. After dinner, Mike and I were cleaning up when Linda approached us, a smug look on her face. "I've been thinking," she began, "with the holidays coming up, it would be nice to have a new coat. Something warm and stylish." I stopped in my tracks, staring at her in disbelief. "A new coat? With what money, Linda?" "Oh, I thought you could use the money you've set aside for, what was it?" "Oh, yes, your son's college fund." That was it. The last straw. Without hesitation, I picked up the phone and called the one person I knew could turn the tide, my grandmother. Gran, despite her age and residing in a nursing home, had always been the matriarch of our family, her word law. After I spilled out the whole sorry saga, she huffed in disbelief. "This nonsense has gone on long enough," Gran declared, her voice crackling with resolve over the phone. "I'm coming to stay for a bit. We'll sort this mess out together." True to her word, a couple of days later, Gran arrived, wheelchair and all, ready to reclaim her territory. As she rolled into the living room, commandeering the space with her presence, Linda and George looked on in shock. "I'll be staying on the ground floor," Gran announced, scanning the room filled with Linda and George's belongings. "So, all this," she waved a dismissive hand around, "needs to go upstairs." Linda's face turned a shade of red I didn't know was possible. "You can't just come in and demand." Gran cut her off with a look that could freeze lava. "This house? It's still mine. Corinne and Mike are here, because I allow it. And that means I can kick you out whenever I please." The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Within hours, Linda and George were scrambling to call movers, their complaints and protests drowned out by Gran's unwavering stance. As their furniture and countless boxes were hauled up the stairs, Gran turned to me, a twinkle in her eye. "Now, let's see if they still feel entitled to steak dinners and new coats." Gran's strategic maneuvering had just begun to unfold in our household. The air was charged with anticipation as we gathered in the living room, the scent of freshly brewed tea mingling with the tension. "Now," Gran began, her voice steady, "we need to address the matter of rent." Linda scoffed, crossing her arms. "Rent? Why should we pay rent when Karine and Mike don't?" Gran smiled, a glint in her eye. "Karine and Mike live here under my grace. They contribute to the household in many ways. But you two," she paused, her gaze sharpening, "have been living off their generosity without giving much in return. I think a rent of $4,000 a month would be appropriate." George's face went ashen. $4,000? That's outrageous. We're retired, we don't have that kind of money. Gran leaned forward, her expression unyielding. "Considering the lavish meals and the luxurious lifestyle you seem accustomed to, I'd say you can afford it." Linda, her voice trembling with indignation, turned to me. "Karine, surely you don't agree with this extortion?" Before I could reply, Gran interjected. "It's not extortion, Linda. It's about fairness. But I'm willing to negotiate." She paused, a sly smile playing on her lips. "If you're willing to help take care of me during your stay, push my wheelchair around, make breakfast, help with my bath, I might consider reducing the rent." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and unappealing to Linda and George, who exchanged a look of utter disbelief. George, ever the pragmatist, asked, "And how much would this assistance reduce the rent?" Gran tapped her chin, pretending to ponder. "Let's say, down to $2,000, provided the help is substantial and consistent." Linda's mouth dropped open, but before she could protest, George cut in. "And if we refuse?" Gran's response was swift and final. "Then you're welcome to find somewhere else to live. This house," she gestured around, "will no longer be your refuge." The ultimatum was clear. Linda and George, faced with the prospect of actually working or paying a hefty rent, seemed to shrink in their seats. The following days were a flurry of hushed conversations and frantic phone calls as they scrambled to find an alternative. Eventually, they announced they had found a small apartment and would be moving out immediately. The process was swift, their belongings packed and removed with a speed that suggested eagerness to leave the situation behind. As their car disappeared down the driveway, Gran turned to Mike and me, her expression softening. "I know it was tough, but it was necessary. You two need your space, and they need to stand on their own." Mike wrapped an arm around Gran, gratitude in his eyes. "Gran, you've done more for us than we could ever repay." "Thank you." In the weeks that followed, Gran became more than just a guest, she was a guardian of our home's harmony, a role she played with a blend of sternness and love that only she could manage. In the calm that followed Linda and George moving out, our house felt like it was finally breathing again. Gran, Mike, and I gathered in the living room one night, the gentle hum of the evening wrapping around us, making the space feel sacred after the storm we'd weathered. Breaking the quiet, Gran's tone turned playful. "Well, as much as I've enjoyed the drama, I think it's time for me to head back. The nursing home misses its most troublesome resident." Mike and I shared a look, already dreading her departure. "Gran, this house is always open for you. It's not really home without you," I managed, my voice heavy with emotion. Gran gave my hand a squeeze. "And you're always in my heart. But don't worry, I'll be back to stir things up now and then." We laughed together, a sound that felt like healing. As we said our goodbyes to Gran the next day, watching her taxi disappear, Mike and I knew we were ready for whatever came next. Together. Our home, once a battlefield, was now a symbol of our resilience, a place where love and boundaries found their balance. And as we stepped back into the quiet of our living room, ready to face the future, I felt deeply thankful for the journey that had brought us here, for the family we were, and for the lessons we'd carry forward. A few weeks later, we heard from a mutual acquaintance that Linda and George were living in a small apartment, having sold most of their belongings to cover their debts. The news came as a bittersweet confirmation of the new chapter they, too, were embarking on, a life defined by the consequences of their choices, leaning on each other, perhaps for the first time in a long while. Reflecting on this, Mike and I realized the true depth of the changes we'd all undergone. Our home was peaceful once more, and though the journey had been rough, it had taught us the true meaning of family, resilience, and love.